Hello everyone and welcome to part 2 of this video series. In this part, we'll dive into an actual code example by building a to-do application. This will help us gain a better understanding of both Redux Toolkit and Redux Saga. So, let's have a look at the application we're going to build. At the top here, we have a quote and its author. This data isn't hard-coded, it's actually coming from an API. Then below it, we have our to-do list functionality. So first we can enter a new to-do item from the input form. And when we click on add, we'll see that it's populated in the list. Then we can complete a to-do item by clicking on the checkbox. If you want, you can also delete a to-do item. Just a reminder that I have a public GitHub repo with both the completed code and the starter code. The link will be in the description of the video. In particular, if you navigate into this code folder, you'll see the completed project and starter project. So if you want to follow along with this video series, you can grab this starter project code. The starter project just includes some basic React components and CSS styling, since I want the main focus of this video series to be on Redux. Once you grab the starter code, let's have a look at a few things it includes. First, I want to mention that I'll be using TypeScript. It's a superset of JavaScript that allows us to perform static type checking, making it easier to catch errors. If you're familiar with JavaScript, don't worry, you'll still be able to follow along. That said, in the starter code, let's first have a look at the models folder. This is where I put the types I will be using throughout the application. First, we can look at the quote model, which includes a text and an author. Then we have a to-do model, which includes an ID, a description, and a completed boolean. Next, we can look at the components folder. This is where I've added some basic React components and CSS styling. The first component we can look at is the to-do item. As props, it takes an ID, a description, and a completed boolean that we saw before. Next, we can look at the to-do list component. This renders a list of to-do items. But we'll see here that there's a hard-coded list of to-dos. Eventually, we'll be building up these components to use data from the Redux store instead of hard-coded values. Next, we can take a look at the input component. This is the component that we'll use to create a new to-do item. Again, we'll see in here that the onClick just has an empty function. Eventually, we'll insert some Redux logic here. Finally, we can take a look at the quote component. Again, this just has a hard-coded value for the quote and the author. So now that we've covered the boilerplate code, let's start writing Redux logic. First, we'll need to install a few packages. As outlined in the Redux documentation, enter the following command: npm install Redux Toolkit and React Redux. Once you're done installing those packages, let's continue by creating a store folder. And in this folder, create a store.ts file. If you remember from the last video, one of the first things we talked about was the Redux store. This is where global application state will live. So let's start creating the store by first importing configure store from Redux Toolkit. Then we can create the store by doing export const store equal to configure store. And we'll pass in an empty reducer. Remember that a reducer is simply a function to handle updates in the state. And lastly, I'll export the root state from this store. We'll be using this later on in our components. Now that we've created the store, we'll need to make it available to all of our React components. To do that, navigate to the index.tsx file. In here, we'll need to wrap the app inside a Redux provider. So move everything inside this provider, and don't forget to import from React Redux. Next, this provider takes a store as a prop. We can import the store that we just created. Now we're done setting up the store, and we can start writing Redux logic specific to our to-do application. Let's create a folder called Redux. And in here, let's create a file called to-do-slice.ts. In this file, the first thing I'll do is create a type to define how the state should look like. I'll call it to-do-state, and it'll have a single data property. That data property will have a type of to-do model, in particular an array of to-do models. Don't forget to import to-do model from the models folder. Next, we can create a variable for the initial state. We'll initialize it with an empty array. Now let's create the to-do slice. We'll be using the createSlice function from Redux Toolkit. Make sure to import that. And if you remember from the last video, there's a few parameters we need to pass in here. First is the name. We'll just call this to-do. Next is the initial state. We can pass in the variable that we created. And lastly is one or more reducers. Again, a reminder is that the reducers are functions to tell us how we can update a state. The first functionality that we can tackle is creating a new to-do item. So let's add a reducer. We can call it add to-do. And for the parameters, the first one will be the state, and the next one will be an action. Remember that an action can include a payload, which is any additional information we might need to update the state. So for the type, we can say payload action, and we'll import this from Redux Toolkit. In particular, this will be a string. So the string we'll pass into the payload will be the description, something like go study, buy groceries, go to the gym. Now in this reducer, we can create the new to-do item. The type will be to-do model. For the ID, let's generate a random one. We can use date.now.toString. Then the description will come from the action.payload as we discussed. And for the completed boolean, we'll set it to false initially. So now that we have this new to-do item, we can push it to the state array. We can write state.data.push new to-do item. What's interesting to discuss here is that with Redux Toolkit, it looks like we're mutating the state directly. It's important to remember that in React, we should never mutate the state directly. However, this piece of code, state.data.push new to-do item, might seem like it is mutating the state. However, it's actually safe to do in a Redux slice because Redux Toolkit internally uses a package called immer, which makes updating the state simpler to write. We can put a comment here if you're curious to read more about it later. Another detail I'd like to mention is that usually, we wouldn't want to have random logic inside a reducer, like creating this ID here. This is because a reducer should be what's called a pure function, meaning it should have the same output for the same input every time. In our case here though, it's not a pure function because we have randomness. Instead, what you can do is pass in the ID from the action payload. But for this tutorial, we'll leave it like this to keep things simple. I just wanted to mention this design pattern. Let's create another reducer, this time for removing a to-do item. We can call it remove to-do. And again, the arguments will be the state and an action. However, this time the string that we pass in will be the ID of the to-do item that we want to delete. So we can write const ID equal to action.payload. And then we can filter out the to-do item that matches this ID. We can write state.data equal to state.data.filter. So this will create a new array that doesn't include the to-do item matching this ID. Let's create our last reducer for toggling the completed boolean of a to-do item. We can call it toggle to-do. It'll have the same arguments. And again, we'll pass in the ID in the payload. Now with this ID, we'll look up the to-do item in the array. For the type, we'll say to-do model. And we'll also say or undefined, in case that the ID we pass in is not actually in the array. Then we'll say equal to state.data.find. So this will check the array if there is a to-do item that matches this ID that we passed in. And lastly, we can say if the to-do is defined, then to-do.completed is equal to the inverse of to-do.completed. So when it's false, we'll set it to true, and when it's true, we'll set it to false. Now at the bottom of the file, let's export a few things. First, we'll export the actions, add to do, remove to do, and toggle to do, equal to do slice dot actions. And we'll also export the reducer for the entire slice, to do slice dot reducer. So we'll see soon that we'll be using these actions inside our React components. Now let's add this reducer to our store. Navigate to the store.ts file, and let's import it. Import to-do's reducer. And then we can add it to the store. Now we're ready to include Redux logic in the React components. Let's open the components folder and start with todolist.tsx file. The first thing we can do in this file is remove the hard-coded list of to-dos. Instead, we want to subscribe to the Redux store. We can do this using the useSelector hook. In particular, this hook takes a function as an argument. The function can be used to select a piece of state from the store. The first argument is the state, and we'll pass in the root state that we created in the store.ts file. And then we'll select state.todos.data. So whenever the state.todos.data changes, this component will re-render and show the new data. Now let's navigate to the todoitem.tsx file. In this file, we'll want to replace these empty functions with actual Redux actions that we created before, like toggle to do or remove to do. In order to dispatch actions, we can use the useDispatch hook from Redux. So we can write const dispatch equal to useDispatch. And first, for the checkbox, in this function we can call dispatch toggle to do, and make sure to import toggle to do from the to-do slice up here. And in that toggle to do, we'll pass in the ID of the to-do item. We can do something similar for the delete button. Dispatch remove to do, and again pass in the ID. Remember that for both of these actions, the payload includes the ID of the to-do item. Now, the last component that we'll be editing is the input.tsx file. Again here, let's use the useDispatch hook. And now we can edit this onClick function. Inside here, we can add a check to see if the input is null. So if it's not an empty string, then we can dispatch add to do item. In particular, we'll pass in the input. If you remember that this add to do action takes the description as the payload. Let's have a look at what we built so far. I'll enter a few to-do items here and see what happens. As we can see, every time we click the add button, a new to-do item appears in the list. We can also toggle a to-do item by clicking on the checkbox. And lastly, we can delete a to-do item. So, we built a fully functioning to-do application. What did we learn so far in this video? Well, we learned how to create a store to hold global application state. Then we learned how to create a slice of state with reducers to handle state updates. We also learned how to dispatch actions with the useDispatch hook. And we learned how to subscribe to the Redux store with the useSelector hook. Thank you all so much for watching, and stay tuned for the next video.